everybody, and welcome to the 4 Solutions to End America's Housing and Homelessness Crisis. I am very excited to be able to introduce Sarah. Sarah and I started talking quite a while ago about this, and she is the Vice President of Policy at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So she is here to really look at and help dive a little bit deeper into what we may have, I hope you just heard with Diane Yantel, and about the broader policy issues. And she's going to dive a little deeper on the 4 major policy solutions needed to ensure that everyone has a stable and affordable home. So throughout this session, if you'd like, please add to the chat so that we can make sure that you any questions you have are available. I mean, we can get them out and we can put them on the chat right away. So we'll look forward to seeing those. And with that, I would love to turn this over to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. It's so nice to be with you guys today. I am sorry that I missed Diane's keynote earlier at the conference, but I know from working with her that she is really inspirational and motivating speaker. So I'm hoping that you're here because you want to learn a little bit more about what the National Low Income Housing Coalition thinks about the solutions to ending the housing crisis and the homelessness in America. So I'm going to start off, but before I do, I just want to say I really welcome robust conversation here. I'm one person, one expert, but all of you are experts in this space too, and I want to make sure that we're sharing ideas. So please feel free to enter your comments and questions in the chat box, and we'll make sure that we try to get to as many as possible. So first, a little bit about the National Low Income Housing Coalition. There we go. And who we are. We are a membership organization. We're based in Washington, D.C. And we're a little different than other organizations in DC. We're not a trade association, which means that we don't represent any particular part of the housing industry. We are solely focused on ensuring that people with the very lowest incomes have accessible, affordable homes, which means that we follow the data of what it tells us about what are the challenges, what are the solutions to homelessness and housing poverty. We do our work in a couple of different ways. We have a field team that engages with all of our members across the country. Our communications team helps shape the narrative with the media. Our research team puts out some of the research I'll be talking about today. And I lead our policy team, which does all of our engagement with Congress and with the administration. So I'm looking forward to really good questions later on about how to engage with members of Congress going forward. So a little bit about the problems. First, I think I'd like to review 2 major reports from the National Low Income Housing Coalition. These are reports that we put out annually that documents different ways of looking at the affordable housing crisis. And the information that you will learn and you read about in these reports really sheds light on what we think are the 4 major solutions to the housing crisis. We'll get to those later, as well as what you can do to help promote and advance those solutions. But first, we'll start with what the data says are the needs. So we all have heard, many of us have heard, I think, about the shortage of housing nationally and in our states and our local governments, our local communities. We estimate that there's a shortage of about 7 million rental homes for the nation's 10 million extremely low-income households. And this is really one of the core roots to the housing crisis and the homelessness crisis. So one way to look at this is the way we look at housing is not, and this is something that drives me crazy when you talk to economists. Sometimes they think about housing supply as being this interchangeable resource that the more you produce in general, the better you are. But what we really find is that housing has to be affordable to people based on what their incomes are. And that is very different from community to community, but there are some overarching trends. And what we see is that whether we're in an urban area, a rural area, a suburban area, whether we're in a high cost market or a languishing market, the same trends are true, which is that the greatest shortage of housing is for people with the very lowest incomes. So one way we look at that is by looking at how many homes are affordable and available in the marketplace that are affordable to people at different income levels. What you see in this chart, this is nationalized data. What you see essentially is that the shortage is nearly entirely from the lowest end of an income spectrum. So for every 100 extremely low income households, these are households that earn less than the poverty limit or less than 30% of their area median income, there are only 37 homes for them. So the other 63, had to do some quick math, the other 63 out of 100 don't have housing options that they can afford. They have no choice but to rent housing that's unaffordable to them, and they have to put an increasing share of their income towards rent. This number, I think, is a little misleading though, because as you see go up the income spectrum, when you get to 80% of AMI, you can see that there's 94 homes for every 100 households. And I think at first glance, you might see this and think, okay, well, there's still a shortage of housing at 80% of AMI that we have to be aware of. But this chart is sort of obscures the issue in a way. It's actually a cumulative number. So it represents everyone between 0 and 80% of area median income, which means that it sort of hides how lopsided the shortage is and how it really comes from the lowest incomes. On this chart, you're going to see this a little bit more clearly. This is the same data, but it's shown in a slightly different way. And what you can see is that when you're looking at extremely low income households, there are 10.8 million households, only 4 million homes. That equals that shortage, that 7 million plus shortage of homes for extremely low income households. If you go up to households at 50% of area median income, you can still see there's a gap between the number of households in that income bracket and the number of homes. There's 6.9 million homes that are very low income, but only 6.6 million homes that are affordable and available to them. So there's a slight shortage there. But by the time you get up to 80% of AMI, there is a very sufficient supply of housing. There is more housing than there are people in that income bracket. And that tells us a couple of different things about what the underlying challenges are to the housing crisis, and therefore what some of the solutions are. It tells us that one, the shortage is predominantly for people with the lowest incomes, but two, that there's a certain tipping point at which the private sector can and does a really good job of building market rate housing. There are some things that we can do to slide that tipping point to make it even more cost effective for the private sector to build housing. You can see that go down. And I'll show you some states where really relaxed zoning and land use regulations can help facilitate that. But it doesn't address the underlying market failure that exists at the low end. And so all of the solutions we push for are really focused on how do we address that market failure where the private sector just can't reach. This is the same exact information. I love this chart because it makes it so clear if you're looking at what is the contribution to the surplus of housing or the deficit of housing by income level. Again, this is the same data that was on the previous two charts broken out in a slightly different way, but this makes it very clear that unless we're focusing on housing solutions for people with the lowest incomes, unless we're building housing that's affordable to that population, we're never going to build ourselves out of this housing crisis. We're never going to end homelessness. And this is a consistent problem across the board. It exists in every state. There's not enough housing, not every state, every congressional district. There's not enough housing for people with the lowest incomes. And you'll see on this chart that it ranges from some of the states with the fewer challenges, I guess you'd say, 61 in Wyoming, 61 in Mississippi for every 100 households, to places like your own state, and even worse in California and Florida and Texas, where there's less than 30 homes for every 100 households that are extremely low income. What I think is really interesting about this map is that it shows that really different political situations in the states. You see Texas, that's deep red, Florida, that's red and turning even more red, California and Oregon, very politically different, very different land use and zoning regulations at the local level, and yet they still have a housing crisis for people with the lowest incomes. Texas is a really great example of that. They have very lax zoning and land use regulations that helps drive down the cost of construction, but it's just not enough on its own to really get to that market failure for the lowest income people. Another way of looking at what about the housing crisis and who has the greatest needs and what the solutions are, you can look at how much people are spending on rent and other housing costs every month. And when you break it out by income level, again, this is another way of showing that people with the very lowest incomes are most severely harmed by the housing crisis. You can see here of everybody who's paying at least half of their income on rent, 73% or so are extremely low income. Another 20% have incomes below 50% of area median income. So the vast majority of the harm, the challenges are impacting these households. Most of the solutions also need to be impacting these households. Again, a major takeaway for those of us who work at the federal level is that there's always this draw to focusing on households that have relatively higher incomes. So households that have low incomes, middle incomes, even higher. And that's a real challenge for us. There's a lot of political power that comes from being in the middle class. Members of Congress want to say that they're helping middle class renters, but that's very clearly not where the need is. And so a lot of the work we do is having to push back against those tendencies. I'll also say that focusing on middle class renters has really harmful racial equity impacts that we all need to be aware of. I'm going to skip to the next slide if I can. This slide, it breaks down the percentage of households who are extremely low income or with the income level by race and ethnicity. And you can see here that when we're talking about extremely low income households, we're talking about households that are predominantly households of color or very often households of color. When you're talking about households that are making higher incomes, they tend to be white households. So there's sometimes we say that when we use the term, housing for the workforce or middle class households, we're really talking about whiter households or the white workforce, and not those who have the greatest needs, not those retail jobs, medical assistance jobs, and others that are paying low wages that are predominantly filled by people of color. Now, I know you guys might be thinking, okay, that sounds great. That's the national data. What does that have to do with my state? I don't, or places like Los Angeles that have huge homelessness problems. How is it that this actually, is this ringing true? Maybe that's something that's national, but our problems are more unique. And I wanted to show a couple of cities where even in the most extreme circumstances, the housing markets that are the worst, you see the same trend line, which is, again, the greatest needs are at the lowest end of the income spectrum. And I am going to move forward. I guess my chart, I brought one for, here we go, for Seattle that I wanted to focus on. And you can see here the same exact trend that we talked about at the national level. There's a severe shortage of housing for extremely low income households, 125,000 households versus 35,000 units. For extremely low income households, go up the income spectrum. Again, there's a little bit of a shortage for very low income households, 93,000 households versus 73,000 homes. But again, once you get to 80% of area median income, the private sector is doing a really good job of building housing that's affordable to those households. So again, the same takeaway is true in Seattle, that it is nationally and that it is in rural areas too. I want to switch over to talking about our second report, our out of reach report. But first, I want to let you know that we do have all of this information about your state housing needs on our website. You can check it out. Here's a copy of the same information here. Again, the same information is broken down that there's only 31 homes for every 100 households that are extremely low income. So that's a resource that you can be using in the future. Okay, our second report I want to talk about is our out of reach report. So we talked about, you can talk about the housing crisis in terms of housing supply and who is being served and who's not being served. by the private sector. Another way of looking at the housing crisis is looking at how much would you need to earn an hour in order to afford a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment. So the National Income Housing Coalition puts out this research every year looking at the prevailing wages in every state and county and comparing that to housing costs in the area. And you can see, again, that it's extremely expensive to afford housing these days in nearly every community in America. And in fact, there are 0 counties in America where a minimum wage worker can afford a 2-bedroom apartment, and only 5% of counties where a full-time worker working minimum wage can afford a 1-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. So even in places that have had the fight for 15, where you've seen an increase in wages, that increase is still not enough to address housing prices in those areas. And this is a really systemic issue. It's because the fastest growing jobs are the ones that pay very little and don't pay enough for a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment. So you can see here, these are the top 10 fastest growing occupations in the United States, and 7 of the 10 don't pay enough to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. This is a structural issue that really goes beyond individual choices about what jobs to work in. This is the jobs of the future in America, and these are jobs that just don't pay enough. So looking at all of this, I think it's not surprising that we saw at one point 30 million to 40 million homes at risk of eviction during the pandemic. Currently, there's another 6.5 million renter households that are behind on their rent, who are applying for emergency rental assistance and are facing eviction as soon as today. I mean, it's happening right now. This is the reason why we saw so many people at risk, and we continue to see them at risk, is because the housing crisis was so bad before the pandemic, and now these households are even more precariously housed. We have been fighting a lot to share the message in Congress that in order for us to prepare for the next time, the next crisis, we need to really be focusing on the long-term solutions that address the underlying causes of this housing crisis. And so earlier this year, we launched the Houzz campaign. I think Diane mentioned this during her keynote. We really wanted to focus on what are those large-scale solutions that are needed, what are the anti-racist reforms that are needed to make sure that every person in America can afford an accessible home. And we started from that as a place of trying to work backwards from. How do we get to this bold vision where we don't have homelessness in our country, where we don't have housing poverty? And we came up with 4 major solutions to the housing crisis that go directly to what the data that I shared earlier. First, we want to bridge the gap between incomes and housing costs. And I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Bridge the gap between incomes and housing costs. We want to expand and preserve the supply of housing, particularly for people with the very lowest incomes who are not served properly by the private sector. We want to create permanent emergency rental assistance tools so that we're not recreating or starting from scratch the next time there's a pandemic or a natural disaster or some other crisis. And we want to have strengthened and enforceable renter protections at the federal level. So I'll go through each one of those now. So very clearly, there's this wage gap between what people earn and what their housing costs are. It's something that can be addressed in part through increased wages, but we know because of the systemic market pressures there, even expanding the minimum wage, while very important, and we support that, wouldn't be enough to fully address the housing challenges. And so we've been advocating for a major expansion of rental assistance, whether in the form of housing choice vouchers, project-based rental assistance, or other new ideas like a renter's tax credit that could make up the difference between what people can afford and what their housing costs are. A good thing is that we're making a lot of progress on this solution. President Biden is the very first president to call for rental assistance for every eligible household. That's a big difference from past administrations, especially the Trump administration, but even before that, we really didn't see presidents talk about housing in this way. When they did talk about housing, it was mostly focused on home ownership. This is really the first administration to focus very much on the needs of renters and people experiencing homelessness, and doing that in a way while also addressing racial equity. So I just want to call that out. One of the things that I think is really creative and we need to give more thought to is the use of a renter's tax credit. This is a proposal that then Senator Kamala Harris introduced for a tax credit that would be allocated monthly to make up the difference between rent and your incomes. We're looking at the child tax credit. There's a lot of conversation in Congress right now. They recently passed an expansion of the child tax credit. They're hoping to get that made permanent in the Build Back Better Act. This is really the first time that we're seeing tax resources allocated on a monthly basis to households. If that goes well, and I think that a lot of people are watching, it could serve as a really important vehicle for extending rental assistance to households and closing that gap between who can afford their housing and who can't. I will say that we also know that there's a lot of reforms that are going to be needed, whether we use a renter's tax credit or housing choice vouchers to get there, to make sure that people truly have access to these resources. Things like simplifying applications, enforcing fair housing and civil rights laws, ensuring that people have the choice about which communities they want to live in. There's a lot of work that we have to do to make sure that we're tearing down the barriers that prevent people from being able to use rental assistance in whatever form it comes in. The second solution is focused on supply. I mentioned before, we really want to see federal dollars targeted to where that market failure is, to where the private sector cannot build housing on its own without federal subsidy. And that really means both increasing the resources that we have for housing, but also ensuring much deeper income targeting for the programs that we do have. What we think are the most important, or some of the most important solutions here are the National Housing Trust Fund and public housing. The National Housing Trust Fund is a relatively new program. It is funded at a very small amount compared to what the needs are, but it is the most targeted federal production program that there is. The housing that's built is affordable to households at 30% of area median income. And we think is really targeted to serve those households that have the greatest needs. But at the same time, we know that we cannot lose our existing affordable housing stock. So we want to see resources that are going into preserving public housing infrastructure going forward. And I'll talk a little bit about opportunities to expand both of those programs in Congress this year, because there's a lot of great opportunities there. Finally, I just mentioned the zoning piece. I think there's a growing consensus among Congress members that zoning has to be addressed and it's a barrier to building housing. You see that among Republicans and Democrats. And one of the ways we think we can help move the needle here is really to tie federal transportation dollars to better zoning outcomes. And the reason for that is because if we were to tie these sorts of incentives to federal housing dollars, you could see jurisdictions, the ones that have the worst zoning practices, turn down their HUD money. We really want to tie those incentives to the dollars that are most attractive to the communities that have the worst zoning practices. And that's usually transportation programs. I am going to go to the next solution that we focus on, which is using emergency rental assistance to stabilize households before they experience homelessness or evictions. When I'm sure you are all working with your state and local governments to spend down your emergency rental assistance dollars that was passed by Congress through various coronavirus relief funds. We actually were working on this issue 2 years before the pandemic. through a bill called the Eviction Crisis Act, and that bill served as the starting point for conversations in Congress about emergency rental assistance. We've learned a lot of lessons along the way. Obviously, there's a lot of communities that are struggling to get out resources, some other communities that are doing a really good job. But we think as we go forward, what we need is long-term infrastructure. Part of the reason why we're seeing so many delays with emergency rental assistance is because communities had to start from scratch to build and plan and design brand new programs. We need that infrastructure in place going forward so that anytime a household, their car breaks down, they miss a couple days of work because their child is sick, that they can be stable in their home before facing that crisis. I will say there's a lot of lessons learned too that we're hoping to incorporate into that bill as it moves forward. Cheryl, I'll stop there.
And I just want to let you know that the audience is requesting if you could put it into slide mode because it's hard to see on some of the smaller screens. And I think we'll still be able to have you there if we put it into the presentation mode.
Is that better?
That's dividing it up. Can you go to slideshow?
Let's see.
And it'll make it larger so everyone can see it.
I'm in slideshow and I'm saying from current slide.
From current, yeah, it should work, but it seems to be dividing up. It's still putting it in. One more try and then we'll jump right back in. It's still somehow not making it very large, but
I'm so sorry about that. We can follow up
we'll
afterwards.
just keep going. I will keep going. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. I wanted to just say very quickly that we're learning a lot of lessons from this experience of state and local governments spending down $47 billion in emergency rental assistance that we want to incorporate going forward. There are definitely things that we did not expect to see, like landlords refusing to accept emergency rental assistance, that I think we need to go back to the drawing board and tweak the bill to address before it moves forward. And then finally, I want to talk about renter protections. Again, I think this is a place where we learned a lot of, we saw very starkly during the pandemic, just how out of whack the power imbalance is between landlords and renters and why that power imbalance puts households at risk of evictions and in worst cases, homelessness. We saw lots of cases of landlords finding loopholes around the CDC's eviction moratorium, exploiting those loopholes to continue to evict people, even though it put their health and safety at risk. And I think there's a growing appetite because of that among members of Congress to look more carefully at federal renter protections, which I think typically has been seen as a state and local issue, but which is gaining support in Congress. So the things we're looking at are a federal ban on source of income discrimination, right to counsel legislation, just cause eviction standards at the federal level, expanding and enforcing the Fair Housing Act, things that can go towards sort of setting a basic level of renter protections for all renters and not just those who live in federally assisted housing. And finally, I want to close on some legislative opportunities to advance this agenda. Our first and best opportunity is with the Build Back Better Act that Congress is very currently negotiating as we speak right now. The bill was a $3.5 trillion bill. It is a $3.5 trillion bill. There are conversations right now about how much lower they need to go in order to bring on Senators Manchin and Sinema, who are more moderate members of the caucus. And if we go to something like a $2 trillion bill, that's going to put enormous pressure on Congress and congressional leaders to cut some of the really important housing investments that are made in the bill. And I just want to go over a couple of those that we think are most important. The bill overall provides $327 billion for affordable housing. Of that, it includes $90 billion to expand rental assistance to another 1 million households. It would be the largest expansion of rental assistance in the program's history. The bill also includes actually, I got this wrong, $80 billion to preserve public housing for its current 2.5 million residents and for future residents as well. There is currently a $70 billion backlog of capital needs in public housing, and many public housing residents are forced to live in really poor conditions. These are resources that would go directly to addressing those health and safety concerns in buildings. And the bill would provide $37 billion to build 330,000 new homes through the National Housing Trust Fund. And again, these are homes that would be affordable to households at 30% of area median income, households that are experiencing homelessness or other very at-risk households that need assistance. Where things go from now, I think we're probably in the most pivotal, most important time for this bill. I mentioned negotiations are going on about the top line level. And there's a possibility, a very real possibility, that these resources either get cut entirely and there's no housing money in the bill, or substantially cut back. And I don't think that's an opportunity we want Congress to waste. We don't want them to do that. These resources, if targeted, if enacted as is, could end homelessness in America, but only if Congress keeps these resources into the final bill, which is why we are asking all advocates to do what they can to contact their members of Congress, especially those Democrats in the House and Senate, to make sure that housing remains a priority. I know that many of you are focused on housing and working with your members of Congress. I'd say for now, skip your lone Republican member, focus just on Democrats. This is really the time period where we're going to see really important decisions being made about this bill and what that means for our communities going forward. Their goal is to get something done by October 31st, but in order to do it by that deadline, they're going to have to make decisions about top line numbers and how much for housing investments starting now for maybe the next week or so. And at that point, things will be pretty much fully baked, and there will be less opportunity to be engaging your members of Congress on it. So now is really the time for engagement. And there are 3 things that you can do right now to support housing investments. I want to just go over a couple of them. One, if you could ask your members of Congress to sign on to a Dear Colleague letter. This is a letter that's being circulated from Representative Richie Torres from New York. A Dear Colleague letter is a letter from one member of Congress to another. It's sort of like an internal way of communicating and signaling what your priorities are. So he's circulating this Dear Colleague letter in support of those house priorities that I mentioned earlier, and in support of including them in a final bill. So if you could call your House members only, we don't have a Senate letter just yet, House members, and ask them to sign on to this Dear Colleague letter. The second thing you can do is just contact your members of Congress, both your senators and your representatives, and urge them to support the highest level of funding possible for those 3 priorities I mentioned earlier. Specifically, you'll want to ask them to weigh in with the House and Senate leadership, so that's Speaker Pelosi or Senate Majority Leader Schumer, in support of these housing investments, to make clear that this needs to be prioritized, even if they are lowering the top line number for the Build Back Better Act to $2 trillion. And then finally, it would be so great to have your support as we're going forward. There are 1,600 organizations on our national letter in support of these priorities. We use this every day to go into Hill offices and to show them it's not just me who's asking for these housing investments. There's a lot of people locally at the state level who are working on housing and homelessness issues who want to see these investments in the bill. So I encourage you to sign on to the letter and to share it with your networks. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to see if there are any questions in the chat box. Maybe Cheryl can help me with that. And do you have any questions?
Sherry, are there any questions in the chat box that you can see? Sherry, would you please unmute and join me for that? Oh, there
yeah, I was
she
looking.
is.
I don't see anything either.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure, because I mean, it was just so detailed and everything that you put in there. I'm surprised there are no questions. So, okay, how about a prediction? Where are we going to end up with this?
I think things are looking better than they were last week on the Build Back Better Act. Last week, I thought there's a good chance that the whole thing could fall apart. I think we're in a much better place now. It seems like there's a real interest, at least among most senators and most Democratic House members, to be able to fulfill President Biden's vision for his agenda. I think we'll end up somewhere around $2 trillion, hopefully 2.3, maybe even a little bit more, because anything more than that is really difficult to, I think, imagine progressives signing on to as well. We're lucky that housing, I think, has been a major focus of especially the Progressive Caucus as they're negotiating. But I think we have a lot more work to do to convince Speaker Pelosi and Senator Schumer and other members of the caucus that these housing investments are really needed. And that's because I know that there's a focus on climate change. I know there's a focus on the child tax credit and family leave provisions. We just want to make sure housing is high enough on their list of priorities so that when they are cutting back, they're not cutting at housing.
Okay. There are a couple in the chat. Here is one that Sherry saw, that there seems to be a huge gap that I don't understand. Why 70 billion for 2.5 million and 37 billion for only 33,000 homes? How many homes or units does the 2.5 million actually represent?
So that's a really good question. I think it's 1 million households, 2.5 million renters in public housing. The reason why those dollars can go a little further is because preservation costs less than building new construction. And I think when Chairwoman Waters was estimating how many homes can be built with the Housing Trust Fund, she used the new construction figures because she wanted to be as conservative as possible in coming up with her estimate. But that's a great question, very observant of you.
And there's a couple too on the NLIHC program, the 9%. The 9% program addresses homeless and 30% AMI housing, while also balancing projects with mixed income housing. This creates net operating income that helps fund operating and services costs. Why is this not a priority program for you guys?
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of the resources I'm talking about in the Build Back Better Act are on the direct spending side. There are certainly provisions on the low-income housing tax credit that may be included in the bill, although I think are also at risk given the threats to the top line number. The bill includes a number of provisions that we support. It expands the 9% credit. It sets aside 10% of those credits for extremely low-income households. It includes a basis boost for some of those properties. It closes loopholes like the qualified contract loophole that some private developers have been using to convert to market rate. It's a very important resource, but it's not our most urgent ask or top priority. And that's because on its own, the low-income housing tax credit often isn't enough to serve extremely low-income households. So we're really focused on resources that are very, very targeted to where the need is. Though I will say we're very supportive of the low-income housing tax credit. We do some work around that too. It's just not one of our top 3 priorities.
Okay, because there were 2 other questions about it. And one was about, does that bridge the gap between incomes and housing costs?
So the low-income housing tax credit, like other capital programs, mostly focus on the development costs, not on the operating costs. That's where rental assistance becomes really important. Without rental assistance, it means that the supply that might be built through this bill wouldn't necessarily be affordable to people who actually need it. And so it has to be a combination of capital dollars and rental assistance. One of the benefits of the Housing Trust Fund is there's a little bit more flexibility there to address operating needs. Up to a certain percentage, I don't have it off the top of my head, up to a certain percentage of Housing Trust Fund dollars can be used for operating expenses. but it's certainly no replacement for rental assistance.
Okay. Those are the questions that we had right now. I don't see any others. If I did miss any, please forgive me. And hopefully we're just a few minutes early, but I think unless there's any other questions, I just want to thank you very much for being part of this. This was so informative. I just learned so much, and I thank you for that. Do you have any final thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody in the audience for all of the advocacy that they've done over the last 19 months. It's been an incredibly difficult year, so many challenges in our community, but I will say that I think all of your work is really starting to pay off. We're seeing much more support within Congress for housing resources, and in large part that's because of your very fierce and sustained and effective advocacy. And we wouldn't be able to do this work without you. So I want to thank you for that.
That is a really great message of encouragement, because so often we hear all the work that's being done that didn't get anywhere, but it does seem to be that there are some things happening. So thank you so much. And I want to thank all of you for being part of this session. We'll look forward to having you in the next block of sessions. And please be sure to stay at the end to greet and say hello to your favorite friend of housing winner as well after the next block of sessions. So again, Sarah, thank you so much.